Good evening. This is a lecture in History 1302 on the presidency of Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, and the coming of the Great Depression. In our previous lecture, Calvin Coolidge is a kind of an afterthought, and as we've looked at the presidents of the 1920s, our first president was Warren Harding. As you may remember, Warren Harding was a interesting character. He was never and never will be considered a great president. In fact, actually, Harding often is considered by historians to be a bad president for his handling of the presidency, for the scandals that went on in his presidency, and just the way he generally conducted himself. As Alice Roosevelt famously said and acidically said about Warren Harding, that he wasn't a bad man, he was just a slob. But Harding himself had many problems as he was a president. And the fact was that with Harding, you could always figure that somebody might have had something on top of him. But in 1920, when Harding was picked by the Republican Party to be their standard bearer in that election, Warren Harding gave over to the convention the choice, which was common back then, the choice of a vice presidential running mate. In the case of Warren Harding, excuse me, he chose, or rather the convention chose for him, Calvin Coolidge. In 1920, Calvin Coolidge was governor of the state of Massachusetts, and he had made a name for himself in combating a police strike in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The fact of the matter is that Coolidge was actually born not in Massachusetts, but he was a boy of Vermont, but he spent most of his adult life in Massachusetts. Coolidge was considered by many to be a very lucky man. In fact, one writer, and I don't remember his name, I only saw the quote once or twice, said that Coolidge was one of the most lucky individuals they'd ever met. That if Coolidge became vice president, you had to expect that Warren Harding would die. And so, of course, that's what happens. Warren Harding does die in 1923, and he dies. Harding, of course, dies of that heart attack in San Francisco. And the country mourns Harding's death. Later on, the country figures out and finds out that he was quite the scoundrel and quite the alley cat and quite a bunch of other things, and just simply the wrong man in the wrong place. And so in that sense, initially the outpouring of support for Harding was there, but the reality is that now we've got Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is never going to be considered a great president because the times never presented him an opportunity to be great. You really find out what type of man you have or what type of woman you have as a leader when the chips are down, to use cliche, when the real problem, say a war breaks out, a depression breaks out, a pandemic breaks out, or whatever. When a real public crisis gets going, that's when you find what type of president you have or what type of prime minister you have. But the 1920s, for the most part, or at least during Calvin Coolidge's presidency, did not provide any of those great opportunities. They will for the next president, but not for this one. And so Coolidge is also, to be fair to him, is not a man who's looking to change all that much. In fact, Coolidge is probably the most conservative, in a modern sense, the most conservative president in the history of the United States. This man, down to his bones and to his very fiber and being, to the 5 strands of hair that he combed over top his head, Calvin Coolidge was about as big a believer in limited government and low taxes and low regulation as you could possibly find. And in fact, actually, sometimes you might say that the Roaring Twenties were partly encouraged by Coolidge's tax policies. Well, anyways, Calvin Coolidge himself is born in Vermont. He's born to a middle-class family. And when we talk about Coolidge, he's a lawyer. He's a handful of things, but really he's also just kind of a character. His nickname is Silent Cal. The man himself is actually very taciturn. And that's a big fancy word for being predisposed by temperament, being a quiet and silent type of character. Doesn't talk much. Sometimes it would be nice if presidents of both political parties would learn that sometimes it's just better to keep your mouth shut. Coolidge had come up with a saying, and it may be original to him or somebody, he heard it from somebody else, but this is how it gets into public history. And by the way, it's going to be taken up by Sam Rayburn of the House of Representatives. It's basically this, that that you don't have to explain something you didn't say. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I say that as a professor. A lot of times you can get yourself into trouble by talking too much or writing too much. Sometimes it has to be said, sometimes it has to be written, but sometimes it doesn't. And that was a maxim. Don't explain something you didn't. You don't have to explain something you didn't say. It was a maxim that Coolidge used during his career, his governor's career, vice president's career, and so on. And it gave him the nickname Silent Cal. Coolidge himself was also quite aware of the celebrity and the notoriety of a silent or seemingly not talkative vice president or political figure could have. Most political figures talk too much. Some just don't know when to shut up. But Coolidge, being who was really quiet, actually made sure that it was put out that he was a quiet man, and it was a true statement. But it also was good politics. It was good PR. Well, anyways, Coolidge famously is going to be be known for being quiet. When Coolidge, who was actually quite funny in his own right by his silence, he could make fun of himself too pretty well. Coolidge was at a dinner, one of those rubber chicken banquets, if you know what I mean, in Washington, D.C. when he was vice president. Now, Coolidge's wife, her name was Grace Coolidge, one of the most elegant women who have ever graced to be first lady. Was not present, but so the vice president, Cal Coolidge, was sitting by himself at a head table at one of these rubber chicken dinners. Now, I don't literally mean they had rubber chicken for dinner, but those of you who have been to enough banquets and catered events know that sometimes, maybe oftentimes, the chicken is a little chewy, and it's also sometimes a little bit dry, and so on and so forth. Which is to tell you, and which is to say, that Coolidge was there and he was eating. He had another event, and I'll finish the story in just a second. Another event, he was asked by somebody why he went to those things. It was before he got to the event, and it was obvious he hated them. He didn't care to be there. But he was asked, well, why do you go, Mr. Vice President? And his answer was, a man's got to eat somewhere. But back to this Washington rubber chicken affair. While he's vice president, he's sitting there at this dinner table, and he's eating. He's minding his own business as Silent Cal, as you'd expect would. Now, this Washington socialite, this female socialite, she was sitting there with her friends, and they knew, and everybody in the room knew, the vice president's taciturn nature. Some knew it by reputation, others knew it firsthand, but this socialite said to her friends, kind of in a bet, I bet I can get the vice president to say more than 2 words tonight. And so she walks up to the vice president. And this is a kind of a high-dollar dinner, but at the same time, it's a different era. It's 100 years ago. People the president and the vice president wasn't cocooned in Secret Service like they are today. And the fact of the matter is that this lady walks up to the vice president. He's eating his dinner, and she begins to talk to him. And she starts to go. And just, Mr. Vice President, how are you today? Mr. Vice President, I'm from Cleveland Heights in Washington, D.C. Mr. Vice President, my father was from Massachusetts. Mr. Vice President, this is that, and so on. She tried everything she could to get him to talk. But in the meantime, while she's talking, the vice president, is sitting there and taking his fork and slowly but methodically chewing up his meat, his chicken. He's eating his dinner. And it's driving this socialite up a wall that she can't get him to talk. And so he's sitting there kind of staring at her while he's eating his meal, and he's obviously a bit annoyed at it. And finally, after a couple of minutes of just talking and almost cackling and almost just prattling on, trying to get the vice president to respond, she finally blurts out and says, Mr. Vice President, I bet my friends that I could get you to say more than 2 words tonight. And with that, the vice president took his napkin, rolled it up, laid it on his plate, set his forks and knife in the proper position, looked the lady square in the face, and said, "You lose." And with that, He said nothing more for the rest of the evening. Now, Calvin Coolidge was not a talkative man, as we've said, but at the same time, too, his coming to the vice presidency was really a cleaning up of the problems that the old Warren Harding administration had left behind. When Coolidge was, he found out, by the way, I should say this also about Coolidge, the not talker. Coolidge was also a sleeper. I often joked with my students in class, if this was it, well, it is class because I'm recording it, but I often joked with my students that if I had become president, or at least vice president, that I'd promised this nation I would sleep at least 8 hours a day, maybe 10 hours a day, and I would stay out of trouble. Now, some of you say the president needs to be awake and needs to be at work. Sometimes maybe it's better served if the president took a nap and just said, this is what we need to do, hired good men and said, go get it done. And so Coolidge, even while he was president, not let alone vice president, but even while he was president of the United States, the top dog, the president slept 8 hours a night and then 2 or 3 hours every afternoon. He took a nap. He was a sleeper, good 10 to 11 hours of sleep every day, and that's how he rolled as president. And in a time period when not much is going on and the people kind of like that and they frankly want to be left alone, it's fair to remember that after the progressive period where there's this great activism and this great attempt at social engineering, the 20s are a wonderful rejoinder for many Americans in the sense that you've gotten past the war, you've gotten past progressivism. It's not rejected completely, but at the same time, it's an eclipse. And you've got this man, in the case of Coolidge, who's cleaning up the mess of the Harding administration, and he's leaving me alone. And that's often at times in American history, that is an attractive trait. And so the idea of leaving me alone is there. And so Coolidge could sleep and sleep well. So, and it led to some people say that, about Coolidge that, that when Rome burned, or Nero fiddled while Rome burned, and someone said, no, what happened in the United States that, when the nation was in trouble, Coolidge snored. In fact, actually, when he did die, Coolidge died of a heart attack in 1933, I believe it was. Coolidge said this was when he died. Someone said to, I believe it was H.L. Mencken, it could have been Alice Roosevelt, and said that about Coolidge said that, oh, did you hear that President Coolidge had died? And someone, whoever it was, replied back, how could they tell? Those sorts of things there. So Coolidge is going to come across as a sleeper, not a doer. He doesn't have much energy in a modern sense, certainly in that sense. He's small in stature, about 5'6", 5'7", lightly built, 125, 130, 135 pounds. In addition to that, Alice Roosevelt, who was an acidic woman, as you've already heard me say once, Alice Roosevelt remarked sarcastically about him, said that he looked like he'd been weaned on a pickle. But Coolidge, actually, had you come to my office during the semester, you would have noticed I've got several characters and several historical figures on the wall. One of my favorite historical figures over the years, because of his conservatism and his natural desire to leave people alone, is Calvin Coolidge. And so I always appreciated that fact. It is fair to say, too, is that Coolidge also governed the same way. But let's get him into the presidency first. Coolidge was actually in Vermont visiting his father, John Calvin Coolidge, in Vermont. I don't remember, this is a little small crossroads town about the size of Snook, where I live. But anyways, it's a small town. This is 1923. There's no electricity in the town. It's just, it's still very primitive, in that part of Vermont where the vice president was visiting his father. And so about midnight, a knock comes on the door. And the vice president and his father get up and they answer the door, and there was a special urgent telegram from Washington, D.C. telling the vice president that the president of the United States was dead. He was now, the vice president had now become president, get sworn in. So Calvin Coolidge will be sworn in the middle of the night, come out of a dead sleep about midnight, 1 a.m., by his father, Calvin Coolidge's father was a notary public in the state of Vermont, and one of the things that notary publics can do is they can swear oaths. I used to be a notary public as a lark 15 years ago, and you can swear oaths all day long. It's not a big deal. Well, anyways, all that to say is that Coolidge was sworn in by his father. Coolidge then draws or is able to get a hold of a glass of warm buttermilk, and what do you think Coolidge did next? After being sworn in out of a dead sleep as President of the United States, Coolidge went right back to sleep and slept until 8 a.m. The fact is that I've always respected him for that. He was a solid enough man, comfortable enough in his own flesh, that he was able to wake up out of a dead sleep, be informed the president had died, you're now the president, and go back to sleep. Sometimes it's just the wise thing to understand and to do. So Coolidge is now president. And Coolidge, as I said, is going to clean up the mess of the Harding administration. Some of maybe his greatest thing was just killing the rats, as they say sometimes, getting rid of the swindlers and the grifters and the bootleggers who were barnacled all over the Harding administration. Anyways, Coolidge is an honest man, and so that's that. To be fair also to the historical record and to not try to make Calvin Coolidge out to be a great president, though I like him a lot, is that Coolidge doesn't do a whole lot. He governed the way he talked, which was not much. He would allow people to come see him. Not everybody, of course, but he would allow people to come see him, especially if he wasn't really interested in what they had to peddle or talk about. He would let them talk, and after about 3 minutes, they would be done, and Coolidge would just kind of, especially if he didn't want to say any more, he just would kind of look at them and look to an aide, and the aide would usher the man out the door. Coolidge told the next president, Herbert Hoover, that if you just let people talk, they will run out of things to say in about 3 minutes, especially in some sort of interview. Well, anyways, Coolidge's presidency is going to be marked by a few things. Coolidge is going to be the man who brings in the radio administration, which later becomes what is it now? It's not Securities Exchange Commission. It is the Federal Communications Commission. Basically, remember this from the previous lecture, radio is coming into vogue in the 1920s and especially the 1930s, and so there's going to be some federal regulation of radio, and Coolidge does that. The government is cut, spending is cut, and in fact, actually, it's under Coolidge's watch that you have a treaty. It's a well-meaning treaty, but it's a treaty to outlaw war. There was some thinking it was pie in the sky and ridiculous in my opinion, but there was some thinking in the 1920s, and at times Coolidge would buy into it, is that the Kellogg-Briand Pact basically is that if we just ban war, we make war illegal, that you cannot declare war, then therefore, because it's illegal, people won't go to war. Well, this happens in the 1920s. The pact does this banning of war. Obviously, you have World War II, in an American perspective, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the Iraq War, lesser wars, and so forth and so on. They're all there. It's a bad joke to me. But anyway, so that is noteworthy. In addition to that, Coolidge is just simply, in a sense, a caretaker. Coolidge in 1924 runs for his election in his own right, and he wins in a landslide. It wins very comfortably. And in fact, actually, Coolidge's election in 1924 is going to be marred by something that he never really recovers from, and that is the death of his son, John Calvin Jr. Anyways, Calvin Coolidge's son was playing tennis on the tennis courts there at the White House. He cuts his foot, which today is not much of a deal. You get a vaccine occasionally, a booster shot for tetanus. Anyways, he cut his foot, got a blood infection, and it killed him. And if I've read correctly, blood infections are pretty horrible ways to die. The kid was about 20 years old, 22, about y'all's age, watching this. So anyways, all that to say is Coolidge is never quite the same again. He had a sense of humor, but it just kind of made him even more grim than he was already predisposed to being grim because of the death of his beloved son. Well, anyways, Coolidge is, when he is traveling, and he's going to be traveling west in 1927. In 1927, Coolidge is going to be asked by many individuals that said, Mr. Coolidge, are you running for re-election? And Coolidge would never tip his hands. He just kind of ignored the question. But going westward, and you can find the photos, and in fact, I'd actually invite you to do this now, but you can find the photos of Coolidge going westward. you will see him visiting the Sioux Nation in the Dakotas. I think it was in South Dakota, but he visits the Sioux Nation. You can find these these photos all over Google, but you can see Coolidge wearing a full Indian war bonnet over his head. He's wearing a three-piece suit for the time period appropriate, and it just looks odd and bizarre. Because he's got that small New England mouth, he's got that kind of pursed lips, he's got no hair, it looks strange. But the better picture, in my opinion, is the one where he is taking with a bunch of cowboys, working cowboys on a working ranch there somewhere in the Dakotas. There are various versions of it, but the one I've always thought I liked the best was the one that Coolidge has this big 1920s era brim hat. It is ugly, it's garish, and it's bad. He's got tassels on his sleeves. He's got chaps on, and the chaps have flares to the side, which say Cal Coolidge or Silent Cal, and he looks out of place. There are men who wear cowboy hats, and it just looks odd. It just looks off. There are men who wear suits, and it just looks wrong. There are men who, or I say men, but it can be women, but there are people who try to wear something, and it just looks strange. And in the case of Coolidge, him being from New England, wearing a cowboy outfit just looked absolutely just wrong. And it was funny because he put it on himself. And he did it. He had a sense of humor in his own strange way. And you can see a lot of those cowboys in the background. If you get the right photo that I'm thinking of, you can see these cowboys in the background. Many of them are grinning like Cheshire cats. Or as my grandfather used to say it, grinning like jackasses eating cactus. Whatever expression or analogy or cliche or whatever you want is fine by me, but it's there. And he's out on this westward trip. And it was here in the summer of 1927, people kept pestering him, Mr. President, are you running for re-election? Mr. President, are you going to try to take another term? And so in the case of Coolidge, what he does in 1927, he is traveling westward. He is, again, dodging the question. He's not answering it. In fact, actually, what's kind of funny is that as he was traveling through, I believe in this case, Missouri, on the same westward trip, he had just finished lunch on the presidential train. And Coolidge sits down, and he sits his hands about like this. And some of you have done this before, maybe in class. I hope not. No, I certainly hope not in my class. But he's sitting like this. And what does Coolidge do? Well, you're thinking, he fell asleep. That's exactly right. And they had stopped. Remember, these are steam engines in this time period. Those steam engines take on a lot of water to build steam and to make steam through the firing process to power the engine. And so Coolidge fell asleep with his hat in his hands like this. They stopped in a small town. I believe it was in Missouri. And Coolidge is woken up by one of his aides, maybe a Secret Service agent, said, Mr. President, this little town, size of Caldwell, which is like 3,000 people, size of Hearn or something like that, small town, wants to see the president. The president's trains pass through. It's not every day that the president comes to your town, and the town turned out to meet the president. And in fact, actually, so Coolidge wakes up, and he kind of combs his 3 or 4 or 5 hairs over his head, makes sure they're in place. And then Coolidge walks out onto the back portico of his train. His car was the last car. And this crowd of people, several hundred, maybe 1,000, were standing around the back of the train waiting to hear from the president and to hear him speak. And so the mayor of the town gets going and gets to talking and says, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States is going to say some remarks to us. Mr. President, tell us what you think. Tell us what you give us a speech. And at that moment, a whistle, which everybody at that time period knew, which was essentially a long and a short whistle, which meant the train was moving, and the train lurches forward because it had gotten all its water. Coolidge steps forward and he says, goodbye. And that was that. And he turned around and went back into the presidential car, and people got a good laugh out of it, and it made the rounds. But Mr. President, Mr. Coolidge, are you going to run for president in 1928? And finally, there in the Badlands of the Dakotas, if my memory is correct, Coolidge, in the summer of 1928, sits down at a typewriter in his personal car, his a personal typewriter in his personal presidential rail car, and he's sitting there, types away, and he types it up with these words, all the same words again and again and again, something akin to the old movie, Jack Nicklaus movie from 30, 40 years ago at this point called The Shining. You know, that one. If you've ever seen it, all work and no play sort of deal. Anyways, Coolidge sits down, takes out a pair of scissors after he's done typing, and he cuts up all these words into little strips of paper. At one of the stops, there's always with the president going to be an entourage of reporters sitting there or following him, reporting to what he has to say, and he walks up to all these reporters from the New York Times, maybe a San Francisco newspaper, certainly a Chicago newspaper of the era, and so on and so forth. He gives these reporters this little strip of paper, and it says, "I choose not to run for president in 1928." And that was that. And these reporters now have their scoop. The president is not running. So the Republican Party and the Democratic Party now have a free-for-all to fill the vacuum of who shall be president, who's going to run for president in 1928. And Coolidge, to his credit, and I don't say that he had some sort of grand design, I don't mean this, but Coolidge, to his credit, always had impeccable timing. It's just like some of you who, when we get back to a regular semester, you move back to College Station or you go to some other college. You may live in a dorm or apartment, but there's always something to be said for knowing when to leave the party at the right time. You don't want to be the first one there, but that's not great, but it's doable. But you certainly won't want to be the last person at a party. And so, because sometimes if you're the last person there, you have to help clean up, or the cops show up, or something like that. So Coolidge left the presidency at the right time. And what I mean by the party, the Roaring Twenties, the economic boom, all those sorts of things, the good times of the 1920s that were on were about to bust, and Coolidge leaves at the most opportune time. But anyways, the Democrats and the Republicans are going to try to figure out who will take Coolidge's place. The Republicans are going to say basically 4 more years. In previous elections, keep cool with Coolidge. In essence, what 1928 the Republicans are going to say, in 1928, if you like what you've had, stick with us. We'll take care of you. And the man the Republicans land on, and they are going to give the nomination to, is somebody who should have been, at least by pedigree, intelligence, degrees, and on like a go. A character. He should have been a great president. And it's one of those things that I have as a philosophy of history, of the presidency particularly, is who makes a good president? Do they have to be smart? I don't necessarily think so. I think they have to have good common sense, good wisdom, and frankly, sometimes you'll find men who are absolutely brilliant as president, and others who have never gone inside a school who become good or great presidents. I think you can say that about Andrew Jackson, who never stepped inside of a school except for maybe 1 year or 2 years of his life. Or you can talk about a Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. Well, I'm not going to talk about Wilson. But Roosevelt, who was a very good president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a degreed man from Harvard and wrote many books. On we can go. But Herbert Hoover, that Republican, 1928, running for president in 1928, was the golden boy. Hoover, but if you know what's coming historically, and most of you do, and that's the Great Depression, you would want a man who is an engineer, a man who is a scientific mind, a man who is a mathematician at heart. You would want a man who has degrees from Stanford. You want a man who is, in fact, a high IQ, who is organized, who is literate. You'd want him in the presidency in this moment of coming peril. You would want him. You wouldn't perhaps want a Coolidge. You probably wouldn't want, say, a Harry Truman or maybe an Abraham Lincoln even. But so the crisis that's coming should be tailor-made for the engineer. They sometimes called him the great engineer. But Hoover, let me just tell you this much. Memory serves, he's born in Iowa, but he grows up in California, goes to school at Stanford, spends a decade of his life early on, around the turn of the century, working in China as a miner, running mines. And so it's fair to remember when you talk about Hoover as a miner, in China, Hoover is such an brilliant individual, and by the way, his wife is too, that Hoover, is able to learn Mandarin Chinese. He is able to write it, and he and his wife will exchange love letters to each other in Mandarin. Maybe a few of you have dabbled with trying to learn a foreign language, but it ain't easy. I'm rubbing two sticks together when I try to speak Spanish. Students who hear me speak Spanish, at least a few phrases that I've memorized over time, maybe have learned in a most rudimentary sense, it sounds bad. But Hoover learned it, and that's impressive. During the First World War, when Europe was facing starvation and famine, and the United States was tapped to help feed the French and help feed the English who had very little foodstuffs, it was Hoover who is going to do the feeding and the saving and the protecting. It was Hoover who did that. All this to say is that Hoover is a great organizer. Hoover knows who to talk to. Hoover knows people in foreign governments. He knows people in the U.S. government. After the First World War was over and the Republicans are ascendant, he's a Republican, Hoover is going to be Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge. And even during the Coolidge administration, Hoover is going to be given credit for relieving the distraught and the afflicted who got hurt by the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927. Understand this: when we talk about the Mississippi River Flood of 1927, Hoover is going to help relieve through food and other things this massive flood that inundates and kills thousands of animals and hundreds of people, let alone stranding and busting many more in the Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, Mississippi River Delta regions. That was a massive flood, maybe the biggest in the history of the Mississippi River. We don't know all of its history, but it was one of the biggest ones we've ever recorded in modern times. All that's to say is that Hoover, and by the way, it is noteworthy and ironic because in times gone by, you never saw the federal government intervene to help in natural disasters. Now it's quite common, of course, Harvey being a Texas example many of you are familiar with. But the fact of the matter is when you talk about that, it is ironic that the most conservative president in the history of the United States, Coolidge, who was president during the flood of 27, signs the bill to give relief. But it was Hoover who organized it, and Hoover is also a masterful self-promoter. By the way, it is also important to remember that Hoover and Coolidge don't particularly like each other. In fact, Coolidge will sneeringly refer to Hoover as Wonder Boy. You call somebody Wonder Boy, that's not a compliment. And then Coolidge also at times would make the remark in 1928 or 29, may have been 27 even, but right at the end of the presidency, Coolidge would say from time to time, I've been getting advice from this man for 5.5 years, and all of it has been bad. So I say all that to, of course, set you up for 1928, then more particularly 1929 in the Great Depression. So if we talk about that, also it's worth noting, too, the Democrats are going to pick their guy. The Democrats are certainly running running from behind. They're running from behind a stacked deck. In 1928, the Republicans are clearly the majority party in the United States, excluding the Solid South. And even there are chips and cracks in the Solid South, that solidly Democratic South. And the Democrats, in a sense, they pick a good guy, but at the same time they pick a bad candidate. When we talk about talk about the Democrats, they pick a man named Al Smith. Now that is a bland and boring name, Al Smith. And he was governor of New York. Now, normally a governor of New York would make a good, strong candidate for the presidency. Doesn't mean he's going to win, but he's a candidate for the presidency because the New York State governor, like right now, at the time of this recording, some of you know who the New York State governor is because he's on television a lot, because he's on the web a lot, because he's leading, for good and for bad, he's leading the response in the state of New York to the coronavirus that we're dealing with at the time of this recording. And that man's name is Andrew Cuomo. There's been much speculation, will Cuomo run for president? Well, maybe so, maybe not. If the election was next year, not in say 12 months from now, instead of saying 3 or 5 or whatever it is, with the nomination already set up, The fact is that it would be likely that Cuomo, I would argue, would run. But all that to say is that the New York mayor is the New York governor is oftentimes a likely candidate for the presidency. But the thing that hurts Al Smith isn't that he's from New York. That could be a problem, but it's also not a damning thing. But this next part was, he was Catholic, and also he was against prohibition. By the time you get to 1928, most Americans had probably, in their heart of hearts, had turned against prohibition. But it hadn't hurt anything, and yes, you may be against it, but you're not against it enough to get rid of it. You can get your booze on the side, on and on we can go from there. But a lot of Americans had kind of tuned out the Reform America stuff through getting rid of alcohol. There was too much activity going on. But in addition to that, when we talk about Al Smith, the Catholic stuff actually hurts him more. He was a Catholic, and Al Smith, and this is worth noting, is the first major candidate in the history of the United States, the first major presidential candidate, to say it correctly, in the history of the United States who was a Catholic and gains the nomination. That could be the Republican Party, in this case the Democratic Party, or even the Whig Party or the Federalist Party in times gone by. So Smith gets the nomination. And immediately it sets the hair on edge of many Baptists and many Methodists, but especially Baptists, it seems like, but both really, in the South. And it gets so bad in some cases that even some Southern Democrats who had always voted Democrat going back to the Civil War, if not before, they switch over for one race, and that is the race for the presidency. And there are a couple of Southern states, Texas being one of which, that go for Herbert Hoover in 1928. For dyed-in-the-wool, as I used to call them, yellow dog Democrats who would vote for a yellow dog over a Republican if he was a Democrat. That ought to tell you how much the prejudice was against Catholics. And the thinking was, and the reasoning was, it goes back to some stuff left over from the Reformation. But the idea was this, is that and it goes back some of it to the Ku Klux Klan as in more recent times for this historical lecture. The thing is that there were some individuals who thought that if you elect a Catholic to the presidency, then what you're going to get is the Pope moving in with the president, and the Pope and the papacy is going to take over and run the U.S. government. It was a far-fetched and a crazy issue. I'm not going to get down into the weeds, but long story short was it wasn't never going to be the case with Al Smith. But, reality can be a little bit different, reality can be different from what you believe. And there were enough people who were at least anti-Catholic, if not, maybe they didn't believe the conspiracy, but they were anti-Catholic. And they just simply didn't like Catholics. They wouldn't vote for him. And so Texas and many, many states go. It was just also a Republican year, to be fair to. I think there's more than just the prejudice stuff, but it was just a Republican landslide, and the Republicans beat the Democrats badly in 28. The story that was told to me when I was in undergraduate, much like you watching this are, it was told to me by one of my history profs at Texas Lutheran. He told the joke, and I heard him tell it twice or three times, so you know it has to be true. Is that when Al Smith lost in 1928, and it was obvious he was going to lose by the time the election rolled around, some reporter came up to Smith and said, "Governor Smith, how are you doing, and what have you got to say?" And Smith, who had a sense of humor, he really did. He was a great, funny man. He said, "Well, I'll tell you, I've got I sent a telegram to the Vatican today." And that, of course, all the ears of the reporters perked up. They're like, "Mr. Governor, what did you say in that telegram to the Pope and to the Vatican?" And Smith's answer was, "I told him to unpack. You're not coming." And of course, it was a joke, and he knew it, and everybody got a laugh out of it, but that was the case. By the way, the next presidential candidate the major party candidate who's going to run who's Catholic and running for president and gets the nomination is, of course, John F. Kennedy in 1960. So all that to say, though, is that we've got ourselves set up, and Coolidge leaves at the right time. Now you've got Hoover, the old engineer, the old math lover and numbers lover, and now you got the Great Depression. The Great Depression itself is going to be a major problem in American history. It's probably the greatest economic calamity in our history at this time. Maybe the only thing that would be analogous to it would be probably the Panic of 1893, but it's bad, and I'll explain more about that in the next lecture. Thank you.